Hi Lakers, and welcome to Wellness Wednesday. My name is Stephanie Green. I am one of the doctoral interns at the Counseling Center, and today's topic is self-compassion. So let's start off with what is compassion. So there's two parts to compassion. The first is noticing the suffering of another person. We can't truly feel compassion or experience empathy for another person unless we are able to see how truly difficult their experience is or what it is they're going through. The second piece is feeling moved by that suffering, so that your heart responds to that other person's pain, because compassion literally means to suffer with someone. So by feeling moved, this helps us to feel warm and caring, usually sparks of a desire to help that person. We'll often offer some understanding and kindness rather than judgment in those moments. So then self-compassion is really just extending that compassion to yourself, pointing it inwards, right? And this is when we are experiencing any perceived inadequacy or failure or just overall kind of suffering or challenges. And there's three components to self-compassion. The first being self-kindness. So this is practicing warmth and understanding toward yourself when you're feeling suffering or you're facing some challenges. And recognizing that being imperfect is inevitable. Perfection is impossible, right? We're all going to make mistakes or face hurdles in our lives. We need to be gentle with ourselves when we're experiencing these difficulties. The second element is common humanity. So when we are suffering and facing difficulties, we often experience a sense of isolation or loneliness, feeling as if I am the only one who is suffering. I'm the only one who is making mistakes, or I'm the only one who's doing things wrong. What's really important is to recognize that suffering and making mistakes, imperfection, is just a part of our shared human experience. It's something that we all experience and we all go through. You're not alone in that. The third piece is mindfulness. This is being willing to observe our negative thoughts, our negative emotions with openness and clarity. Being mindful is a non-judgmental, receptive mind state where we can observe thoughts and feelings as they are without trying to ignore them or deny them, really just seeing them for what they are. One way that we are often not very self-compassionate is through critical self-talk. So let's do a brief exercise on how to challenge or change that critical self-talk. So the first step in challenging that self-critic is to notice when you're being self-critical. Your critical voice might sometimes become so common, we hear it so often, that we start to not even realize that it's there, or listen to it without ever challenging it or taking a moment to question it or ask if it's true. So the first step is to really start noticing it and be a little bit more aware so that we can take the next steps. So whenever you're feeling bad about something, whenever you're questioning yourself, whenever that self-critic says something pretty mean, take a moment to think about what you just said to yourself, specifically what and how it was said. Try to be accurate as possible about what words were used, really kind of not sugarcoating it or not missing parts of it, like specifically what was said. And then ask yourself these questions. What words do you actually use when you're self-critical? Specific words that were used. Are there any key phrases that come up over and over again, or specific words that you see popping up often? Think about the way that this phrase was said. What was the tone of your speech? Was it kind and friendly and sing-songy, or was it maybe more cold, harsh, angry? And then think about whether this voice or the words remind you of anyone or anything. Anyone in your past that was maybe critical of you or put you down. So for an example, say you find yourself eating a lot of sweets all in one day, and then inner critic pops up and says something like, "You're disgusting," or something equally as mean. You take a moment to think about these questions. What words were specifically used? Disgusting, right? What's a pretty powerful, pretty negative word? Are there any key phrases that keep coming up over and over again? Maybe disgusting pops up often. Maybe that's a word that stands out when you're making other mistakes, or you're in other situations that critic pops up in, and disgusting comes up a lot. What was the tone of voice when you heard that you're disgusting? I would imagine that it's probably not super kind and friendly or happy, right? It was probably a little bit more harsh or mean. And then wondering whether or not that voice, that word, reminds you of anyone. Maybe it's not specifically the word that was used, but the way that somebody made you feel, or the way something was insinuated. So now that we have a little bit more information, or a little bit more in touch with what it is that was said and how it was said, we want to make an active effort to soften that critical voice. What's really important here is we want to soften that critical voice in a compassionate way rather than judgmentally. I think we can sometimes easily get caught up into further negativity if we approach that self-critic judgmentally. So, for example, if we're going to think about it in a judgmental way, we might say, my self-critic told me I'm disgusting. What's wrong with me that I'm having thoughts like that? Or I suck for having that kind of thought, right? And again, while we might be challenging that thought in a way, we're really feeding into further negativity and putting ourselves down more and thinking that there's something wrong with us for that thought being present, which is not the case. So for a way for us to soften that critical voice in a more non-judgmental way, we might say something like, okay, critic, I know that you are trying to keep me safe and to point out the ways that I need to improve by that comment that you made. But it was pretty harsh, and that judgment, that harshness is not helping. It's really just hurting me. So maybe we can let my inner compassionate self say a few words instead. The third step is to reframe the observations that you have just made by your inner critic in a kind, friendly, more positive way, right? So when we went back to think about maybe why the critic would say something like that, is because they were trying to keep me safe or trying to show ways that I need to improve, right? So how can we kind of flip that from you're disgusting to something a little bit more positive and more helpful, right? Some ways that might be more helpful to think about how to come up with a phrase for this is to imagine what a very compassionate, super loving friend might say to you in this situation, or what you might say to a friend when they're saying something like this to themselves. So we can try something else, like coming back to that sweet example, the overeating of the sweets. Thinking of, okay, I know that you ate all those sweets, but you did it because you were feeling really sad and really down this week, and you thought that it might cheer you up by eating something that made you feel good. But now it's just kind of made you feel worse, right? I want you to be happy, so why don't we do something that feels nice, like taking a walk, or calling a friend, taking a hot bath, something like that. By acting more kindly with feelings of warmth, those feelings of warmth and caring will follow eventually the more we practice this, right? So while it might feel a little unnatural to say something like this to ourselves, especially if that self-critic is really loud and a lot more present than we would like, it takes practice to get better at it. So the more we ask ourselves these questions and soften that self-critic and give a different kind of twist in a kinder way of what that message is, the more practice, the easier it becomes and the more natural it becomes. So if any of this was helpful for you, thinking about more ways to be self-compassionate, more ways to kind of challenge that inner critic, you can go ahead and one of the great referrals is Kristin Neff. She is a really great reference point. She's like the queen of self-compassion. You can go to her website at selfcompassion.org. It's a self-compassion.org. And she's got a ton of information and resources on self-compassion, along with a bunch of different activities similar to what we did today that will help you kind of build up that self-compassion a little bit more. We also run a self-compassion group at the Counseling Center. It's one of our skills groups that we run every semester, so that's another way to get a little bit more practice and a little bit more information if this is something you're interested in. Alright, well, thank you all for sticking through this video. I hope that you learned a little bit today and that you can all be a little bit more self-compassionate and a little bit kinder to yourself this week. Alright, thank you.